Doctor Who pretty quickly burst into mediums besides the actual TV episodes. It was as early as 1964 that Doctor Who comics started coming out. And towards the tail end of Tom Baker's era, in 1979, Marvel Comics Presents Doctor Who Weekly started, a magazine that would eventually morph into Doctor Who Magazine. These Doctor Who magazines would always, or virtually always, include comics of the current Doctor having unique comic-specific adventures. In 1980, the fourth Doctor had a comic adventure called The Star Beast. 43 years later, that comic would be adapted for television as the first David Tennant 14th Doctor 60th anniversary TV story. Today, we're talking a few weeks before that 60th anniversary TV adaptation will air, and so we are discussing the 1980 Star Beast comic itself. Talking today will be myself, Neo from Australia, along with Ingiga and Oliver, both from England. We'll talk about all sorts of things unique to the Star Beast comic, and we'll also chat a bit about its 2019 Big Finish audio drama Tom Baker adaptation, and some interesting things Russell T Davies and David Tennant and others have said in the lead up to the TV adaptation, including the writers of the comic from back in the day. But before all that, I wanted to ask you two, do you remember when or how or anything about you first learning about this comic, The Star Beast?
I think the first exposure to it I had was a while back when there was just lots of posting about Beep the Meep all of a sudden. And I wasn't fully aware of why this was happening. I think it may have been caused by the Big Finish adaptation, or it might have been before then, but I was just seeing Beep the Meep just everywhere for some reason. I was like, what the hell is this? I kind of wrote it off in my mind a little bit. Like, I wasn't fully aware that this was from a comic that is pretty important and would go on to be even more important. So I was just dimly aware of Beep the Meep. I wasn't really aware of any of the other stuff. But that was when the Star Beast first came into my awareness.
Yeah, it would have been about the same time, I think. It was Beep the Meep was suddenly blowing up as a example of how absolutely ridiculous the extended universe goes, and the fact that there's this most evil emperor who looks like a big fluffy hamster. And then only a couple of years after that, it got confirmed that Beep the Meep was going to be on TV.
So in 2019, the comic had a sort of resurgence through that audio drama we're talking about. Even I know Oliver and I have heard that audio drama. Gig hasn't, but obviously its tendrils touched him in some way since it kind of resurged talk about Beep the Meep. The comic also has lived on a lot because it didn't just come out in 1980. It's had a lot of reprints. I know right now you can buy it in a Fourth Doctor anthology paperback that's come out recently, and it's had a lot of different reprints across the different sort of Marvel US strands that have had like reprinted Doctor Who comics over the years. There's actually 3 different colorizations of the story, and they do actually look pretty different. Beep is blue in some of them, he's white in some of them. In the 60th anniversary, he looks white as well, so it's interesting. But the Wrarth Warriors look green in the 60th anniversary, which they're not in the colorization that Beep is white in. So there's all sorts of different changes there. Clearly, the comic has lasted through a lot of years, is what I'm saying. I'm not trying to get into colorization nerdery. It keeps getting reprinted. It keeps getting adaptations. Why? Like, why does this comic keep going? Why didn't it just stay in the 1980 and never, like, get brought up again?
Well, first question, what colour are they if not green?
Well, they're green. I'll show you. For people listening on audio, they are a kind of brown in that version.
Oh, yeah.
As for your actual question as to why it's lasted, I think, well, start with just because it's delightful to read, I think, would be the main thing. And also because I think it just communicates a tone for Doctor Who that translates very well. Like, you can see a lot of what became New Who in this. I think, and obviously that's a really trite observation to make about this comic, but I think just the basic tone of it and the way in which it handles a really absurd incursion on ordinary working class life, the way the people in like the human town react to the Meep's presence, and also the way that the aliens talk and interact with the characters. It all has a quite familiar tone to it, and it feels it just translates very, very easily and obviously. Like, it doesn't have any sort of stodginess to it. It doesn't feel like sort of it doesn't feel like it's reaching to try and be sci-fi in particular. It's just got a very casual tone.
In 2019, in some copy about the audio, Nick Briggs said, "The Star Beast has a slightly different feel. The alien monster craziness is contrasted sharply with a dash of kitchen sink drama and a touch of Grange Hill, which predated the TV series, exploring more domestic settings. It's interesting how the brilliant comics writer of these strips, Pat Mills, kind of anticipated this." Talking about kitchen sink drama and talking about it kind of feeling not stuck in the past, we haven't said the actual 3 words here, but it feels like RTD, basically, I think is the idea. It feels like Russell T Davies' kind of vision of Doctor Who, I think. This kind of kitchen sink approach, kind of how the companion Sharon and Fudge are characterized in the story. What the story is kind of interested in, like the scenes of having the Wrarth Warriors at like a table eating cake, and it's like a very domestically weird contrast with like super high concept alien stuff with very normal, you know, living around in a poorish community and, you know, eating and that sort of thing. It's a very, very RTD1, or I assume RTD2 kind of feel to it, which I think is part of why it hits well right now. And that's just an appealing way to do Doctor Who in general. It's not only RTD that does it that way, which is probably part of why it lasted through those colourisations over those decades.
Like at one point, the Wrath surgeon who's doing an operation on the Doctor says, "I'm a surgeon, not a vet." You know, there's that bit of there's that kind of bickering to them, which feels lifted straight from like humans and Earth and kind of familiar Earth settings, but just transposed onto aliens. And like you say, that is a very immediate, direct way of doing Doctor Who, in a way that's both funny, charming, and also, you know, blends the strange with the mundane. Like, it's just a classic format.
Sharon and Fudge especially feel very revival. Sharon's working class, but has this now very familiar pushback against the Doctor. There's a moment in the comic where he makes her jump off a high thing, do something scary by insulting her, and she, you know.
Although that is ripped direct from, which serial is it? He did that with Sarah Jane, didn't he? That thing where he starts being really horrible to Sarah Jane to get her to crawl through a vent or whatever. So that did feel like a conscious reference to that. But also it's sort of, like you say, it's referring forward as well, I think, because we can see also in how, like, the companions sort of shown to have her compassion for the Meep, misplaced though it is highlighted a lot in the comic. And I think having a bit of a sort of emotional arc with the companion, just sort of showing them trying to do something by themselves before the Doctor gets stuck in. Again, that is very familiar in New Who as well.
And then with Fudge, you've got that postmodern awareness of what kind of sci-fi story this is, recognizing the spaceship by the kind of spaceship he's seen in comics. You know, that's very revival as well.
I think this is all true, but I think the biggest part of why it's all remembered, it comes back to what we said right at the start. It's the Meep. It's Beep the Meep. You just can't. The design is so good. And the dramatic irony of, like, you start the comic and this thing it's very, very cute, but it's a little bit off. Like, there's something that doesn't look totally right about it. And then what I love, the audio does this even earlier than the comic, but in the comic, we go a fair while where Beep the Meep is acting cute and normal. And there's a few weird things, like when it starts calling that cat over and we're like, well, that's a bit weird that it's talking to the cat. We don't see what happens. You probably start wondering, is it going to eat the cat? It prefers the cat over the sugary tea. What's going to happen? And then before the characters learn that Beep the Meep is this terrible, tyrannical criminal, we get the internal monologue of Beep the Meep, which is, how dare they be petting me, and I hate having to purr for them, and I'm going to kill them in all these crazy, torturous ways, but now I've got to put up with this to enact my evil plan. It's very amusingly acted in the audio as well, to kind of get inside the mind of Beep and hear that, and the comic does it in a cool way as well.
Of course I can talk, Earth Girl. But if you knew what I know about the Warriors of Wrath, you'd be screaming for your worthless mortal life.
Reckon we gave other aliens the slip, though. No way they'd know to find us here.
Yeah, pray that is true, for your sake.
Don't worry, Meep. We won't let any horrible monsters get you. Or social workers neither.
Not my ears again. Please don't let her touch my ears again.
I think that contrast of really, really cute, well-designed creature with it's actually incredibly evil, and the dramatic irony of we, the audience, know that, before the characters, including the Doctor, the mastermind knows that. I think that's just really, really, really fun. It's just a really winning kind of story. I think it's just very, very appealing.
Yeah, I think the juxtaposition between the Meep's internal monologue and the Meep's actions. So it's putting a very cute face while monologuing about absolute genocidal death and slaughter in its brain. I think that's the funniest part of the comic for me. I really hope that the TV adaptation finds a way to do that, because it's just really entertaining. And obviously, like you say, like the art, the way the Meep's overly cute expressions are drawn, just its boggle eyes kind of just innocently blindly staring off into space. And then of course the way it changes whenever it's in evil mode, so its pupils like sort of contract and it sort of looks like this fiendish thing from hell. And then of course you have the iconic panel where the Meep kind of shows its true colours for the first time. It whips out a gun, because Meep and just completely eviscerates one of the Wrarth Warriors with the gun. And that's another thing I hope is done as close to the source as possible on TV, because that moment is just perfect. Just those two panels. I think just the way, just the image of it holding the gun and just this snarl of pleasure on its face as it fires off. It's just really, really fantastically envisioned and realised.
The Wrarth Warriors as well are just a great design. I think they look excellent as aliens. I'm glad the 60th seems to be adapting them super close visually. I think that's a really cool, distinctive design as well.
Yes, it's interesting, especially that this is a companion introduction story, in the way that it feels like foreshadowing of all of the later companion introduction stories. The idea that you've got one rogue villain who's being hunted by a big police force from space, that's, the Atraxi and the Jadoon. But you've also got cute alien who's actually cruel is sort of the adipose thing. You can see how this story had ripples, because the formula just works it gets you the different kinds of stories that Doctor Who can do. It gives you camp, and it gives the aliens and sci-fi interacting with ordinary life in a way that sets up what the show can be in a really succinct way.
Yeah, New Who has been ripping this off for years, basically.
And so it makes sense in a way to go back to it for the 60th. Go back and do the blueprint itself.
It's a great Doctor Who-y turnaround as well, that the Wrarth Warriors look grotesque and ugly and evil and everything. And then, I don't think they're quite good guys exactly, but they're more like the Jadoon. They're not out there being malevolent, straightforward sort of evil. They're just bioengineered cops trying to apprehend a criminal, even if they're trying to do that in pretty intense ways. Like we see at the start of the story, they don't think much of Earth in how they're trying to get Beep out of it. But that switch around of you just assume it's the bad guy because it looks like the bad guy, but then it turns out they're not the bad guy. That's Doctor Who going back to the, that's a very Doctor Who-y sort of trope to pull.
I think also with the Meep, the tone of how the Meep and its species are kind of portrayed, there's something sort of whimsical inherently about them. You know that page, I think, which you might have said was your favourite page?
Oh, I love that.
Where we see the history of the Meep in those 3 stages. And each panel, they have a funny little rhyme corresponding to like where they're at. So the first one is a very silly, happy rhyme, hop, skip, jump. And then as they get more like brutal and horrible, they're saying, hippity hop, time for the chop. Like that's really funny. So I think that's a wonderful example of just how in a few words and just a few short images and a few rhymes and just using techniques in that way, you convey something that's not trying to be realistic at all, and it's more poetic if anything, but it just has that inherent just that irreverence of the limerick almost, just that very intrinsic snappy wit to it, which I think is just perfectly expressed through like the Meep. So I think it's another great aspect of the tone of the story. And the script is just, it's got so many really good things about it. I
love the backstory for why they're evil as well. It's not over-explained. It's a very kind of fairy tale-ish, it's like a satanic sort of thing, that just this black sun emerges and it's radiation. They don't go into the science of this at all, but the black sun comes out, and it hits the light of it, or the darkness of it hits the Meep planet, and then they go from hopping and jumping and skipping to galactic conquest and pure evil. I just love that it's not very techno-babbly. It's just this kind of arresting image, and it's visual, it's a comic, it's an actual image. This black eclipsy sun just like poisoning them as they drink it in and become evil. I just love that. It's got a really nice, fantastical sort of vibe. It doesn't overdo the sci-fi of it.
Yeah, it's mystical feeling. Yeah, I think imagery like a black sun, I think it has some weird, like, alchemical, kind of mystical, sort of magical vibe to it. That's very fun.
Yeah.
The audio codes the backstory in a, I thought, really quite strange way.
Yeah.
It describes Meep society before the Black Sun as from Meep according to their ability to Meep according to their needs. And it later refers to the steelworkers as Bolsh.
Yeah. That's all Alan Barnes. That's not in the comic.
The Meeps were an advanced agrarian species, living an idyllic existence in huge, hollowed-out meep heaps. Theirs was a cooperative society. Its motto, from each Meep according to his ability, to each Meep according to his needs. A utopia, where the Meep heaps resounded to the tune of the merry Meep music.
All together, children! Hop, skip, jump and sing, for joy bees, all in a ring. Hop, skip, jump and sing, for joy bees, all in a ring.
Utopias never last, Sogros.
Indeed not.
It's a strange choice, right?
Yeah.
I see why adapting you would want to do more with the backstory, because it's a little, like, it's fun, but it's a little bit superfluous. But to code it as this sort of fall of communism thing is maybe trying to do more with the material than is there.
That does feel on brand for Big Finish, though, throwing in random political
Yeah.
overtones onto something.
And really just gesturing at it, like, no real point to be made, just going, yeah, so they were communists and then the Black Sun came and they went evil. Which, yeah, takes away the fairy tale vibes as well.
It does, yeah.
And I think that what that says about the comic itself is that the fact that in doing an audio felt they had to expand on it so much, I think it's because the storytelling style in the comic, in these 5-page increments, really, it's super, it feels compressed. So it's just really, it's quite relentless. I mean, there's a lot of storytelling done in about 5 pages, and it doesn't really slow down at any point much, I would say. It's quite relentless, and it's just a kind of storytelling that isn't super worried about the details so much as it is the rush of the ideas. So it's not trying to be super psychologically realistic to any huge degree, or like explore, like, it doesn't have like massive deep monologues about themes or anything like that. But it's just really intensified in terms of everything is as in your face as possible. You know, every moment is like as drawn to its extremes as it can be, and the art conveys that very well. You know, it's very dynamic artwork. So yeah, I feel like the way that the beats come in this really relentless fashion is just it's inherent to comics. You don't really get that in any other form of Doctor Who. Certainly not in the audios and not on TV either.
Yeah.
I think let's talk about the art, because the way that the Meep, Beep the Meep, is realised is absolutely fantastic. That's what sells the story for me, I think. But the way things are framed, it's got a real purpose to it. Generally really impressed with the artwork, especially seeing as this is, in Doctor Who magazine, right?
Yeah. We haven't said their name yet, but this is, of course, Dave Gibbons. So this is real art that's going on here. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, this is the guy who did Watchmen.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
You know, this the co-creator of Watchmen, along with the mysteriously absent other co-creator. Yeah, that's a real artist. It's nice to read a Doctor Who comic where the Doctor actually resembles the actor they're supposed to be depicting. Yeah, that's quite refreshing after some of the New Who comics that I've seen. Yeah, so it's genuinely quite good artwork. I mean, I think Sharon and Fudge don't really look much like kids, but yeah, I can kind of excuse that, to be honest. But like, I think just overall, it's just really, really dynamic, powerful, distinctive artwork. And on the note of the art, I read on the black and white version, and I think to me, like looking at the colorizations, the black and white version is the prettiest in my view. I think you don't really need the colorizations, because I think the original black and white artwork, like the pen and ink, everything's so clear, there's so much detail, and it's balanced really well. And I feel like the colorizations start to get a bit weird. Like they almost kind of flatten some of the detail of it, which I think you can't really avoid with colorizations a lot of the time. But I just think the pure black and white style of the original is just so good. Like I just feel the colorizations are a bit redundant.
I think generally speaking, when you're composing an image, knowing it's in black and white, trying to add lots and lots of different colours on top of that ends up just muddying what the actual image is going for.
Yeah, I think usually the best colorizations of black and white stuff are ones where the abstractness of black and white is translated somewhat into the color. Like you get maybe slightly abstract uses of color to keep the sense of contrast between the dark and the light. So good colorizations tend to do stuff like that. And I'd say like the earliest colorization of this kind of tries to work with that a little bit, I would say. But again, there's also still weird aspects to it, like the whites of the characters' eyes kind of leak out in that one. So yeah, it's kind of dodgy. And then later colorizations just get kind of maybe trying to be a bit more realistic, but also muddier in the process. But anyway, I don't need to keep ranting about that. I would say the Wrarth Warriors, just one more thing, sorry. I'd say the Wrarth Warriors I think the way their design works, I think, is because they are so bony and exoskeletal. The way they come off on the page, they almost look like this almost incomprehensible like tangle of bones, and it makes them really imposing, I think, especially in the black and white version, but just in general. I think I think it's almost one of those designs how, even though they've translated it pretty faithfully for this upcoming TV version, I think you can never quite get the full impact of them, just because the way that they impose, the way that this tangle of exoskeletal bones kind of reads in these flat lines and shadows, they almost feel kind of overwhelming, like you can't quite grasp the full boniness of them. They just look really imposing and really good.
And the way their eyes just jump out of the images as well, that's something you struggle to capture in live action.
I love the bit at the start where the Doctor kind of inadvertently grabs one of their eyeballs and starts squeezing it. That's fantastic.
I like their characterization as well. The part where they're like kind of pretending to fire on the Fourth Doctor because they want him to escape, so he goes to the Beep the Meep and they like hide out on the TARDIS and stuff. It's fun to see them kind of work their plans. Even though they're misidentifying everyone as allied with Beep, it's a fun sort of shift when they tell the backstory and we actually get to kind of ally with them a bit more. But they're not like the Jadoon are very, very straightforward, one note, and like the comedy with them is just that they're super like serious in that way. But I like that the Wrarth Warriors have this kind of comedy of like when they're taking bits off their bodies to like offer to the Doctor to help like go on the quest and stuff. They're just. I think it's a fun characterization.
Yeah, they're written more like humans than the Jadoon are, because the Jadoon have that whole speech gimmick of blow, show, blow, and they're just... And the Jadoon almost talk robotically, like, enemy identified. Whereas the Wrath, they have all this... There's something a bit camp about them almost, some of their dialogue. Like, so I think they just have an inherent likability to them.
And it's just nice that you get both of the alien monsters in the story get to just sort of hang out at Fudge's house for a bit.
Yeah.
It collides the grounded real world and the crazy sci-fi world in that really fun way.
But I'm not talking about the present day 60s stuff here, but I think there's something interesting. We talked about Dave Gibbons, the artist, and of course the writer was Pat Mills, who's also famous for a lot of what they've done, like Judge Dredd and that sort of thing. They visited the set when RTD was making the TV version of the Star Beast, and they did an interview about that with Ben Cook, which I think is pretty interesting because imagine you write or draw a comic, many decades ago, and then far in the future when you're much, much older, you get invited to go like see it actually like literalized and visualized. That's got to be a pretty cool experience, I think. Not something you'd ever expect to happen.
Yeah, it wasn't even a standalone comic or anything like that. It was part of it was in Doctor Who magazine. It was part of a serial. It was followed afterwards by the next serial. It was part of a job. It was part of a career for these guys. So, and maybe if things had gone differently, it might have just sort of slipped into one of the many things they'd done. So it really is like one of the most unexpected things to have like a massive revival and just be super significant years and years later. But I guess that's the magic of Doctor Who, isn't it?
Yeah.
Things can always come back. Nothing's ever really gone. And the most obscure things can actually have an afterlife just because if they have some element to them that actually persists. Because I guess because this franchise in general is so... don't want to say backward looking, but it's reverent of things that last. I think it has a lot of recurring DNA in it.
RTD was 16 when the Starbase started being printed, like the first part of it. And he has a lot of very nice words to say about it. He says, 2 kids find a monster in their shed and it's the most hilarious monster ever. A furball, And then he talks about why it syncs up with what he's trying to do with the 60th. And he says, it's the best story in the world. Sometimes I think there's no better story. David Tennant says, I had no clue Russell was adapting it. So when I first got the script, then David Tennant chuckles to himself happily. And then he says, an email pinged through, the first special script arrived. And I looked at the front page and it said based on the Star Beast comic strip written by Pat Mills and John Wagner, drawn by Dave Gibbons. I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely gobsmacked. Then for it to be really quite a loyal adaptation in many ways, that was glorious. Then, of course, there's the bit, we talked about this a bit earlier, that Fudge is like this very self-aware character and that, he's obsessed with comics, and in a very Doctor Who fan way, he's obsessed with the semantics of how you refer to things. When David's asked, did he risk brain rot and read the Star Beast as a kid? Because, there's the discussions in the Star Beast comic about too many comics rotting your brain. David says, oh God, yes, I'm not making any of this up. I remember that early run of Doctor Who weekly strips very, very clearly. It was a very evocative time in terms of nostalgic memories for me. The Iron Legion, City of the Damned, the Star Beast in particular. The comic strips were better than the telly at that time. Before I talk about the set visit thing, do you guys think this comic is better than like what we were getting? So this came out between season 17 and season 18. So this is like between, I guess kind of Shada. Horns of Naimon and the Leisure Hive, I guess it's between.
It's better than both of them. I'm not sure it's better than the series in general.
I think regardless of your opinion on individual serials, I think it's easy to see how maybe the experience of following these comics from week to week and just how they're very short, bursts of madness in some ways. I think it's easy to see how people might have been enjoying just that week-to-week comic experience more than necessarily sitting down for the serials on Classic Who in that period of time. Because I think there's a lot to like about season 18, for example, but I think it's just fundamentally different. I think the experience for fans of things can be very, very different depending on the format. So I think. I think it's easy to see how Doctor Who magazine might have just been a real burst of fun for people following along with it every week.
Yeah,
that's going to colour your memories of a time period a lot. I think having a weekly supplement like this.
The TV comparison reminds me. There's actually something I should say before going to the set visit. This is actually really interesting. I don't know if you guys know this. This comes from a Dave Gibbons interview in a 2000s. I think it was actually pre-New Who. I think it was 2004 reprint of the Iron Legion and the Star Beast. It's like a black and white reprint of the comics. So Dave Gibbons has a fairly big interview in that reprint. And so he's talking about where the Star Beast comes from, how he got onto Doctor Who in the first place, how he liked Doctor Who because he had a lot of control over what he was doing with the early Doctor Who magazine or Doctor Who weekly comics. So he's talking fairly happily about all that sort of thing. With the writers, Pat Mills and John Wagner, they get credited together for these Doctor Who magazine comics they did, but only one of them would actually do it. You know how some writing teams work that way? So Pat Mills wrote all the Star Beast, even though they're credited just as one of two writers. Anyway, when Dave Gibbons is talking about persuading, the boss to get them onto the comics, writing the comics, Dave Gibbons says, I wangled that. I knew that Pat and John had submitted a slew of Doctor Who stories to the BBC, but there was a change of script editor and they hadn't had any success selling them there. I knew they had these plots, so I suggested to Des that I might be able to get them to write the strips. I spoke to Pat and John, who thought it was a reasonable idea and a good thing to be seen, to be working somewhere other than IPC as well. That was how that came about. End quote. Mills and Wagner did 4 stories between them, all based on their rejected BBC submissions. Dave says, when it came to the actual scripting of the comic stories, Pat and John worked entirely separately. They rotated the comics, blah, blah, blah. When Pat and John came to write them the stories for the comic, they broadened them out considerably from what they had been. The great problem with Doctor Who, the television series, has always been the limited special effects, whereas in the comic we could have robot Roman legions and werewolf troopers and things like that. So the thrust of all that is the Star Beast and a lot of these other comics were based on pitches to the BBC for TV stories that didn't go through and then were expanded to be bigger because they were a comic. They can do more things visually.
That's a really interesting trajectory then, isn't it? We start as an unrealised TV pitch, we go through a comic, and then much, much later it gets made an actual TV episode in a period where it can actually get the budget that it needs to convey, I guess, the different things that it's doing. I dare say, if the hypothetical TV version of the story had been made in the 80s, it might not have been as good as the comic. I don't know. I can't see the Meep being realised anywhere near as well, on certainly an 80s Who. Not to impugn 80s Who too much.
Yeah, because one of the huge boons of comics is not just the lack of budget, but also the sheer control over the visuals. You know, there's no limitation on where you can put the camera and things like that. And so to have it open up a new, very director-focused era of Doctor Who, very visually impressive by everything we're seeing, that makes sense in a way, right? Going back and adapting a comic that's defined by being too expansive to fit on TV.
It's a very, what's the word for this? This thing where, like Gig said, it starts off as a TV pitch, it turns into a comic, expanding the TV pitch. It gets kind of visually shifted over the decades, and it becomes an audio drama with anti-communist leanings, and then it becomes a huge, like enormous, this isn't just a regular TV episode, this is we need the whole world to see this, we're changing the whole show thing. It's, I don't know the word to describe this. It's a really, really interesting journey for a story. Yeah, there are probably lots of different words you could use for it. It's been evolved and metamorphosized and sort of it's had several different iterations of itself. It's gone on quite a journey.
I would wonder if that was part of the reason it's being adapted for the 60th, is that it's a story that has already been adapted so many times. You know, even just in comics form, it's been released and re-released and re-released.
Yeah.
And then it's adapted for audio, and it was originally a TV idea. It would make sense as a story that just keeps on getting adapted to do it as a big on-screen adaptation. You know, in a special that's backwards looking and adapting an old era.
It kind of reflects the role that comics play in, like, I guess, the history of the show overall, because they have this odd, relationship with the main show. Because I would say a lot of what people enjoy and like about Doctor Who, the main show, is done. It's stuff that is communicated through having actors and being able to do great dialogue, having Tom Baker, stuff like that. Not so much the visuals. But then with the comic version of Doctor Who, which has existed for a long time, kind of in tandem with the show, you can do a lot of the same things you can do in the TV show, but obviously you don't have actors. But you can get all of everything that isn't the actors, it's almost. So all of the premises, all of the visuals, inventions, all the crazy aliens and settings and stuff that you might be able to do in the show, you can do to the nth degree in a comic. So a comic is like almost the sort of strange twin of the TV show. It's like it's like a form of Doctor Who which, in one sense, is just as true as the main Doctor Who, despite being fundamentally quite different. It just has this weird, like, sort of off-kilter, like, sort of weird twin sister relationship with the TV show. So it's interwoven in a way that is really fascinating. It's just like, it's like always the bridesmaid, never the bride, but nonetheless kind of really important.
Yeah.
And I think in a way that the fact that it's decentered, the comics, you know, aren't the main show, lets you do a lot of things that aren't just visual, right? Like Sharon's the first Black companion, right? And you possibly would have struggled more doing that on TV than you would in a comic. Perhaps.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in this set visit interview. I won't focus so much on this bit's different in the TV and this bit was in the comic, because I think that's more of we'll discuss that when the actual TV episode's out. But the stuff more from their perspective about the comic, I think is really interesting. So it starts with Ben Cook asks them, were you surprised when you were approached about this? Pat Mills says, completely surprised. A BBC producer got in touch. It came out of the blue. Dave Gibbons says, it was a very uncomplicated, very positive inquiry, which isn't the sort of thing you're used to in comics. You tend to be ridden over a bit roughshod. So to have somebody be respectful and polite enough to say what they wanted to do and ask us how we felt about it, and to talk about remuneration for it. Pat, which helps. Dave, you think, yeah, maybe these guys' hearts are in the right place. The word is respect. They've been so respectful of what we tried to do. Pat, it was so different to most of my experiences. He means with screen adaptations of his comics. That's all we want, is just a little bit of respect. And we got more than that. You saw on our day on set. It was wonderful. And then Ben Cook brings up, the director, Rachel Talalay, was so thrilled to meet you. This is legendary, she kept saying. Absolutely legendary. Also, I overheard her telling you, the comic works so well, I wanted to make sure we're honouring your vision. Dave, she was doing more than that. What she's done looks amazing, even better than the images in my head. Pat, she's taken the writer's vision and made it work. That's what Dave does. Dave, they've been so faithful to the comic, it's very true to the spirit of it. What do you think of all that stuff?
Yeah, I think when they talk about being treated with actual respect, unlike with people who usually want to adapt their comics in some form or another, I feel like it feels like some inevitable aspect of how Doctor Who relates to this kind of stuff. I feel like a Doctor Who episode adapting an old Doctor Who comic is always inherently going to be done with a certain degree of, we love this, we love these people, we really want to tribute them, rather than we just want to make content, which you might get, I guess, with like some non-Doctor Who example of, some company or whatever, just stripping the rights. Oh, we need to fucking get this comic hero in a movie, we're going to take this, we're going to take that. I feel like with Doctor Who, there's just inherent, I think this all feels like, it all nonetheless feels like one big family, I think, with Doctor Who, even if it isn't in practical terms. I think there is a sense that everyone wants it to be a big family because it is Doctor Who, even though it's all these separate little bits and pieces throughout the years. Like, it's very easy to bring stuff in because it's all like a big love, and especially for a 60th anniversary. So I think it's nice that Doctor Who can engage with its old comics writers and stuff in a pretty good way. I mean, there are rights problems with things sometimes with Doctor Who. It's not all fun and games, as we've seen recently. But I think with something like this, it's nice that it can go really well.
They talk a bit about changes there. We can talk about that when we discuss the TV episode. Dave Gibbons knows what they've changed. Pat Mills doesn't. So there's a kind of interaction where they're kind of talking around stuff, which we don't quite know as well yet. Anyway, Dave Gibbons says of the comic, we had this idea of some vast intergalactic event and it boiling down to a shed in the backyard of a 2-up, 2-down British house. I think to come back to a very recognisable England and a pretty down-at-heel working class England was a location that hadn't really been featured before. And to put in the middle of that some really fearsome intergalactic terrors, Pat, the tone of the TV show at the time was not just set on other worlds, but some of them were, how can I put it? Not easy to absorb. And they were slightly losing that younger audience. The stories were becoming more complex. But we were like, well, we can do what we want here because it's a comic book and no one really cares.
At the end of the comic, just this is related to what they just said. Just before Sharon, I guess, leaves with the Doctor in the TARDIS, the last thing she basically says to the Doctor is, it's like she talks about how she defines the Doctor in terms of the fact that he doesn't have like bosses or bills or nosy neighbours, right? And it's like the whole, so it's like the whole basis of the relationship between her and Four, as set up there, is the fact that it's explicitly defined in terms of him being a break from this working class environment of financial stresses and I guess like a paranoid, atomized society of everyone in these kind of like kind of claustrophobic neighborhoods. So it's even though obviously it's not done with the whole character-driven thing that you get in like the Virgin New Adventures or New Who, whatever. In terms of just sketching out stuff in very simple terms, basically every word counts. And I think when you have something like that flagged up, the last thing she says there is, "I couldn't imagine you with a mortgage." That's a real statement of intent, isn't it?
And that's something that feels quite familiar now, for sure. That's a big part of New Doctor's relationships with the real world. So it's interesting to see its fingerprints here. Also, while I was reading the comic, it really struck me that this really beat E.T. to the punch.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it?
It's 2 years before the film E.T., and it's very E.T., but with an extra twist on top, I suppose.
Yeah, kind of deconstructs E.T. before E.T. was even constructed.
Yeah, the idea that there's a sweet alien who lives in the shed of an ordinary house, but is actually evil. It goes one step beyond E.T.
When Ben Cook relays that David Tennant thinks the comics back then were better than the TV show at the time, Dave Gibbons says, "What a nice man," and Pat says, "I like him." So that's nice. Ben Cook asks, "Did those strips you were doing back then feel groundbreaking to you at the time?" Pat says, "I'd like to think so, yeah. There was a sense we were doing something mildly groundbreaking and no one was telling us not to. Also, being able to say things like, let's have a black companion for the Doctor, it was really important at that time because black characters rarely featured in British comics. Dave, I'm very proud of the fact that we gave the Doctor a young black female companion." Ben Cook, only 27 years before the TV show did. Pat, whereas now it's making a point of celebrating diversity. And we have to keep on doing it because there's still a bit of an imbalance in some areas. Yeah, the more diverse the characters, the better. In the case of Sharon, I also wanted to capture that British Grange Hill feel. I was a huge fan of Grange Hill. Yeah, my understanding is Sharon was the first black companion to go through multiple stories in Doctor Who. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the fact that it took 27 years or however many it was for the TV show to even catch up, I mean, that's extremely telling and not in a flattering sense.
I also think there's something interesting, and maybe we'll talk about this, or someone will talk about this more regarding the episode itself when it's out. But there's something interesting in the character filling Sharon's role in the adaptation being a trans woman, and how not that prejudices can necessarily be translated and adapted across generations, but certainly there's some connection there. And the fact that that's happening on TV rather than being stuck in comics where nobody really cares, that's quite exciting, I think.
Yeah, there's a different bit of the interview where Pat gushes over Yasmin Finney for a while. So, yeah.
You know, that comment about how they wanted to get Grange Hill influence, kind of in there, I think that's quite telling in terms of where their interests were, because I think there's a sense of this something that's not sci-fi at all, but they wanted to actually let it come into Doctor Who in a sense. I think that's a telling of I think that's part of why their vision for Doctor Who remained so accessible and relevant over the years. I think because they were letting it, they were willing to let it not just be kind of abstract mathematical alien concept. They were really interested in actually communicating those genre, I guess, markers of stuff that wasn't sci-fi at all, but was much more based around relatability to young people and just to just regular people. So yeah, I think it's really admirable approach.
I think it's also interesting that it's northern. It's massively northern. It's set in a fictional. It is fictional, right? It doesn't actually exist. Black Castle's not real.
No, it's not real.
But it's a little town in Yorkshire, with a steel industry at the centre. Yeah, and I also wonder what it means to be adapting a very, very Yorkshire, working class Yorkshire town story, adapting that into being set in, Camden in London. It's a very different feeling.
I think earlier on there's a comment someone makes about Black Castle, which is it might be on one of the first few pages, which reminded me intensely of We Don't Get Aliens in Sheffield.
Yeah.
From Chibnall's Who. Because, Chib was doing the whole steelworks, northern town, alien intrusion. Not obviously not in the same sense as this, but almost like Chib did the whole northern kind of alien intrusion style, whereas I guess the RTD's version isn't doing.
It's funny you say that, because I think this is just in the audio. There's a bit where the Fourth Doctor kind of disses Sheffield Steel.
Oh, wow. How could he?
He says he's never got the hang of it.
Okay.
These are Sheffield Steel. Pity. I never quite got the hang of Sheffield Steel.
Which, I checked through the comic, isn't in there. So that's a backwards, forwards reference, but sort of cute.
And that was 2019, right? So that would have been directly influenced by, would that have been a direct reference to Chib? Would have been recorded before, do you think?
Oh, I assume that's a reference.
The last thing from Pat Mills and Dave Gibbons that's worth talking about here, they talk about how surreal it was to see the Meep in person for a while. And so Ben Cook asks, where'd the Meep come from? How did you dream up the Meep? Pat, it came together very naturally. Dave, we described it as, and we both knew it was supposed to be, a cuddly furball, but I'm wondering if we based it on something? Pat, well, it was partly based on guinea pigs because I had this guinea pig as a kid and the noise it made was this meep, 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 which is the sound of the Meep. As I got home from school, the guinea pig would hear my footsteps and start going meep, meep. Of course, guinea pigs have a certain viciousness about them too. Then I remember, get the violins out, my guinea pig died. Dave, oh Pat, don't put yourself through it, mate. Pat, so my mum got me another one, and the neighbour's kid picked it up and dropped it. So that one died as well. And Ben Cook says, what a lovely story, Pat. And Pat says, after that, we decided no more guinea pigs. Dave Gibbons then gets his phone out and shows a photo of his cat called Princess Millie. Ben Cook says she's the spit of the Meep. I'm not sure if that's meant to be spirit, but it says spit in the magazine.
No, it's spit, like short for spitting image, like it's that kind of thing. Yeah, slang.
It's a British expression? Okay, I'm learning.
Yeah.
Dave Gibbons says the resemblance is uncanny. Ben Cook asks, is that why you picked her? Dave Gibbons says, no, we had another Maine Coon cat. It was a darker colour. And then we got this one, but she's weird. Like she gets pink ears when the light shines through them. The Meep on set made me think of Millie. To see the sunlight coming through the Meep's pink ears, like, whoa, it's astounding. And then they compare some of the settings in the comic to how the episode realized them. But that's basically the thrust of the Pat and Dave interview, which I think is a really cool interview to get. That's a pretty special thing to have an artist and a writer 40 years later on set seeing a fairly faithful realization of an old comic. Pretty cool.
They invoke pets a lot there. And I think throughout the certainly the early stages of the comic, you can see how the Meep as this big furball is likened to something from the pet shop. You know, it almost acts like a dog or a cat or a guinea pig in some places where like they're scratching it and cuddling it and stuff, and you know it's looking very innocent. So I think it's just that sense of cuteness. I think again it's something that is drawn directly from real life. You know, even though it is slightly warped, it is nonetheless a warped thing of something that's recognizable. So again, it's just that sense of relatability, I think, coming through in the ideas and the design. Just shout out to one thing that they do in the comic that you probably couldn't do on TV. When the Doctor's kind of showing his credentials to the Wrarth Warriors and demonstrating that he's actually a good guy to be trusted, he holds up this medal that he got for defeating the Cybermen, and it's just like a Cyberman face with a big X over it. Like, thank you, Doctor. And yeah, that feels like one of those meta details that's kind of in the comic that it's almost like too self-aware for the TV show, I think, certainly at the time.
Yeah.
Like, it's like just, okay, he X'd out the Cybermen. And that's kind of endearing. I think that sense of slight irreverence of tone is another thing that is kind of beloved about the comic, in my opinion.
Between K9 and, you know, Sharon generally as a companion, the whole thing with the comics is we don't really see how they fit in to the continuity, right? Often they just don't. And so that's part of the irreverence of it, right? These are stories that can't really have happened if you're taking that realist approach to continuity. And the fact that they can't really have happened means, you know, get loose with it. Who really cares?
Yeah. They're operating within a nebulous idea of Doctor Who rather than within the strict confines of like the story of Doctor Who. So they can just sort of do, it's a playground for them. They can do whatever.
When David Tennant talks about the differences or similarities between the TV show and the comic, these specific comics, when these Doctor Who Weekly comics started coming out, he says, it was the first time that a Doctor Who comic strip felt, to someone who loved the show, like it got the measure of the source material. It represented the TV show that it came from. The Doctor was recognisable. It took the source material seriously, as 8-year-old me believed it had to be taken. The TV comic strips, by that is referring to like the old ones, like the 60s ones, is irreverent the word, the weird ones.
What, the John and Gilliam ones?
Yeah, those sorts of ones. Yeah.
Yeah, those ones.
Tennant says the TV comic strips always felt a little bit like they were made by people who had no idea what the show was. Like they were done by a committee. The Doctor Who Weekly strips just felt right. As a kid, I loved them. They were stories that you could imagine being on the TV if the TV show had a multi-million-pound budget. Pat's an amazing writer, and Dave's a great artist, isn't he? What was nice was him being enthusiastic to see his designs being shamelessly ripped off 40 years on. The Meep is a beautiful design, so are the Wrarth Warriors, so of course we didn't change them barely at all. I believe there was a bit of a journey in designing, particularly the Wrarth Warriors, where the art department went kind of far from the source material, but then ended up coming back to it because they couldn't better it. Dave drew everything so beautifully, and Pat and John's stories carried you along.
Yeah, I think that distinction between like the old TV comics and like the Doctor Who Weekly comics are actually taking it seriously. I think it's a good representation of, I guess, how comics changed, I guess, in terms of how they're like certainly spin-off licensed types of comics changed in the relationship to Doctor Who. Because I think with like the very start of the show, I think the idea of a comic based on like the earliest Doctor Who, it must have been this weird unfamiliar thing. It was like, how are we doing this? Fuck it, let's just do anything. And it's only when things actually get formally enshrined and start to make a bit more sense and start to actually like, well, this is actually a real thing, it's a real formal thing that we can actually start doing now, as that you get this new era of actual, I guess, proper Doctor Who comics that are actually not just a thing to just toss off there, but a thing to actually, I mean, you know, they're part of this Doctor Who magazine, and they're it's out of reverence for Doctor Who and actually love of Doctor Who, rather than just content, I suppose.
On the design of the Wrarth Warriors in the adaptation, I think it's interesting how we were talking about the comic Wrarth Warriors feel so realised because they're detailed and they're complex and there's a lot going on with them, and the TV ones feel very faithful to that, but in being faithful to that feel sort of exaggerated and cartoony. And both of them work, but it's interesting how you take basically the same visual, put it in two different mediums, and it has the opposite effect.
Yeah, I can see that comment they made about how they strayed from the source material at first and they ended up coming back to it. I can see why they might have been trying to stray from it. I think they must have been trying to have something that has the same effect in live action as the drawing did on the page. I think that's very difficult. So I think I can see why basically just coming back to the original drawing, just doing that in live action and just letting that be what it is in live action, even though that is very different. You know, it's nonetheless like Doctor Who is not all about, you know, complete internal visual consistency and having everything be the same visual style. Like, you can have things jar and disrupt stuff and it can be fine.
It also occurs to me now for the first time that if they didn't want people to assume that they were the villains, they probably shouldn't have called themselves the Wrarth Warriors. Just, it's not a great name. If you're a good guy, don't call yourself that.
Wrath might mean something else, you know, in other languages. Like, who knows? Maybe it doesn't sound like wrath to them, even though it does to us. I would say if they didn't want to be thought of as villains, maybe shouldn't put bombs into people, in people's stomachs. Children of Earth style.
Yeah.
Or Woman Who Fell to Earth style. That's one of the other things that...
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
This, one of the other series openers that this feels very similar to, down to the northern setting.
Yeah.
It's crazy how many series openers are doing riffing on this story. That's, wow. Why is it always the openers?
I think it just works. Having two factions of monsters lets you do a couple of twists, and having a monster that looks cute and is actually mean lets you explore the camp of Doctor Who. I think it's just a great formula, to be honest. I think that's the main reason.
Tennant said to a different publication, Tennant said, "I couldn't believe when I saw the first script what it was adapted from. Because of course I recognised that immediately as a child of the 70s and the 80s. I knew exactly where the source material lived and it was a deep joy. It sort of makes perfect sense. Russell as a long-term fan and also that particular story, the way that it captures that particular world of Doctor Who is sort of the world of Doctor Who that Russell is known for, I think. The way the Doctor interacts with a family in modern-day Britain and the makeup of that family and how the extraterrestrial hits the domestic, it sort of makes sense, actually, as a starting point for a Russell T Davies Doctor Who script. So after my initial surprise, I was duly thrilled, I think it's fair to say. I certainly have very vivid memories of those old Pat Mills, Dave Gibbons stories as someone who grew up with a TV comic where the Doctor Who comic strip, which was sort of what I got it for, never felt like it truly captured the spirit of the show. It sometimes felt like it wasn't perhaps the most carefully produced piece of work. Then suddenly Marvel Comics takes over and you had this world-class comic book artist beautifully creating these alien worlds and stories that are so brilliantly written. So they were absolutely reminiscent of the TV show, but also had their own kind of reality that was so creative and exciting that I think it was a really big moment when Doctor Who Weekly started with those comic strips.
Yeah, something about the Star Beast in particular that I think reflects that whole thing about how the Doctor interacts with the world and how that recognisable version of Doctor Who kind of continued. Is that very early in this story, they find a reason to take K9 out of the narrative completely. They just he's broken. He's purring like a cat now. We're going to leave him in the TARDIS because I think if K9 were to follow the Doctor out of the TARDIS for the rest of the story, he'd basically invalidate it because he can shoot things and do all sorts of shit. So I think it's telling that, you know, we've got, okay, we're just going to bench K9 so we can actually have the Doctor interact in a more organic way and not kind of trucking this sci-fi thing along with him all the time. I think that's kind of telling about where the story's interests lie.
The audio writes him out altogether.
Oh, right, he's not even in it, okay.
There's a line at the beginning the Doctor mentions having left him with Leela, or possibly Romana, I can't remember. But I think that's also part of them trying to fit it into continuity. But Yeah. I mean, that's the canine problem, isn't it? Canine has a big gun in his face so he can solve all the problems, so you've got to leave him in the TARDIS each week.
Rewinding a few minutes to that interesting point made about how this really configures into a lot of like series premiere stories like The Woman Who Fell to Earth. It's interesting to hear RTD's reasoning for why he uses this, or he's going to use this story. When he's asked what made him want to revisit it, he said, "I don't think I gave it much thought. It just popped into my head. The whole point of the story," he means the 60th anniversary story, "is that the Doctor meets Donna Noble again, so therefore it has to be on Earth. So therefore she's going to come across something alien, and so therefore it's handy if she comes across one alien. She's not going to come across an invading army. That's going to ruin the story." So it very quickly starts to narrow itself down. The Star Beast is very much E.T. It's a traditional story. So to find that pattern pre-existing in Doctor Who with Pat Mills and Dave Gibbons attached, we're in an age of comic book adaptations, little knowing that was a Marvel product then, that we'd be under the same banner as Marvel. But it's a great story. I was 16 years old when that was published, and I've always loved it. To this day, you can say The Star Beast to a fan, and they'll know what it is. There's not many properties you can do that with.
You know, I think there's a risk of people interpreting that comment from RTD as kind of a bit mercenary, like, oh, I needed a story where Donna meets something alien, let's just do that. But clearly I think it's a sense that the fact that this thing already existed was a really exciting opportunity, I think. Even though, it serves the broader practical purposes of the 60th. But, like, I mean, he could have just done, like, a shitty rip-off of the Star Beast, like there have been so many of already. Like, he didn't have to actually do the full thing, but he did, I think. And it's because doing the full thing provides really cool opportunities to actually just revive and adapt really good ideas. So, yeah, I think, it's and it is cool that Doctor Who can do that. Maybe less cool that it's under the same banner as Marvel content now, but that's a separate thing.
I wonder if RTD would acknowledge that, I'm thinking Smith and Jones in particular, but his general pattern of companion intro stories. I wonder to what extent he would recognise a real narrative inheritance. Like, there's clearly a huge influence. So I wonder how conscious that is. I
mean, even look at the adipose, right? Really adorable alien thing that turns out to be deadly.
Yeah, to a lesser extent, the what's her name, the plasma for cute old lady, actually a murderer.
The only other interview thing I have, I guess, is RTD saying, when he's describing his Star Beast episode, that it's a lovely, exciting family film, very Pixar-based. Even before Disney got involved with this, I was going for that. It's like a bank holiday film. It's lovely and exciting and fun. And then he talks about the Donna stuff in it. Would you describe the comic as how he's describing it? Pixar, bank holiday?
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, like, at the climax of the comic, well, I say the climax, it's kind of glossed over, but one of the cliffhangers is that the Doctor gets sucked into a black hole and he's experiencing pain inconceivable by mankind. He's being ripped apart. There's that sense of almost like unbelievable bluster, I think, to parts of the comic. I think it's part and parcel of that relentless pace of it, and it's perfectly happy to just have people zapped and exterminated and all sorts of things going on, and people getting brainwashed, and there's a lot of there's a fair bit of violence in it, not like bloody or anything. I think it has quite muscular and kind of like fast paced and quite snapshot sort of I'm talking gibberish. But I think, it does not evoke Pixar family film to me. I think it is much more I think it's more aligned with the interests of, I guess, kids who read comics. Not really like, parents going to the cinema with their kids. This is like, I think, like, I mean, we're talking about people in their early teens, maybe, reading comics. It's a different kind of demographic.
Beep is introduced covered in blood. So, on top of what you said, also, it is quite bloody.
It's pretty intense as well. When Beep starts, like, enslaving the steelworkers, like, it's not, like, it's very funny, but it's not like it's not played super lightly, even though it's a joke, if that makes sense. Like, Beep is really evil, how Beep treats people. Yeah,
Beep glories in, like, pain and cruelty and just sheer horror. I mean, he's chopped people's heads off, right? It's quite visceral executions that Beep has been complicit in. And I think the comic is kind of enjoying the slight edginess of that as well.
Yeah.
Again, stuff you can't do on TV as much. You can go a little bit further in a comic.
I love all the panels where it's just the whole idea that you can't have an animal without a leash on like the bus. And so they use the Fourth Doctor's scarf as the leash. Then you get all these extremely cute panels of Beep, like with the scarf around them. It's just, it's adorable, very funny.
Yeah, and the fact that while Beep has the scarf, we were still getting the internal monologue bubbles of like, I will kill all of you, I will slaughter you. Yeah, it's just very, very funny. And another bit I love, when the Beep shoots one of the humans and Sharon's like, what have you done? And Beep's like, oh, it'll just put them to sleep. And then in their thought bubble is forever. It's just fantastic gags all the way through the story.
On what Gig was saying about just how dense it is narratively, how many ideas there are in it, I would assume for an adaptation you'd have to trim some of this stuff out. Like, having the psychically enslaved steel workers and the engine fires and it destroys the planet, but only for a millisecond, and then it gets undone. There's like a lot to it that maybe doesn't quite so easily fit the pace of a single episode of TV. Like, there's a lot of building to cliffhangers, which makes more sense in a comic than it does in a 1 hour special.
Yeah, the fact you need a cliffhanger every 5 pages, that like shapes the tone and the structure of it, like pretty much entirely. It is all about like how exciting can we get this in time for the next 5 pages, get people coming back next week for the next 5 pages. So it's just completely different language from television. So any TV version of that will be able to dip and dive with the pacing in very, very different ways. It's going to feel hugely different. And I guess it's just a case of like, do you have the fundamental fun and like the spirit of the thing, less so much the specific structure of it.
The lack of visual storytelling in the audio version really sucks some of the joy out of it. There's a lot of people stopping and describing what a Wrarth Warrior looks like when one turns up.
The tongue gag scene doesn't really work either. Like when the tongue gags the Doctor, Tom Baker tries, but that just doesn't really work on audio.
Yeah, my other thing is that while the Black Sun works fine in the comic, I'm not sure you need the backstory, but like you say, it's fun. And it works fine, but the audio version seems to be trying to make a point with the Meep, and it all doesn't work because the whole point of the Meep is he's just a cartoonish, evil little guy. Just cartoonishly evil. There's a point where Sharon goes, but what's wrong with being happy? Which, in later eras of the show, might get played as an authentic beat, but here it's clearly exaggerated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the danger of trying to draw a point out of it sometimes like it's a question of why are you doing this? Like, clearly the original wasn't worried about that.
There's smarter ways of doing that as well. The audio just sort of baffled me in general. Not really sure why it exists and why it's like that, but...
Hop, skip, jump and sing. We feel like doing very bad things. Hop, skip, jump and sing. We feel like doing very bad things.
The Black Sun radiation mutated a race that was once gentle and kind into cruel beasts who only live for conquest.
Hop, skip, jump and skip. Everyone needs to mighty washing. Hop, skip, jump and skip. Everyone needs to mighty washing.
Oh, there is another adaptation comment, speaking of the audio, that I remember that's kind of interesting. Old Gary Russell, back in 1994, for that reprint of the comic, in like a forward to the comic, was, speaking of why the Star Beast is great and why Beep the Meep is so great and such a visual, great character and everything like that. And he says, as a creation, the Meep is something that could never have been done even reasonably successfully on a Doctor Who television budget. And unlike Daleks, Sontarans, Quarks, Chods, and Cybermen, it is almost unique in its simplicity. 1994, saying that the TV shows in the past, and so this could never have been done on TV, and so isn't that nice that now it can?
Yeah, I think specifically the fact that it's like a living being the fact its facial expression changes is really important. Because if it was just like a static, like furry head thing, it would just look like shit. Like it wouldn't work. You'd lose all the humour of the Meep, and it would just. I think in a way the fact that it's as we're seeing, I guess, in the new TV adaptation, they're doing some of the facial effects with CGI a little bit. You can do that. So you can, and that in a way, that's a kind of animation, and which is in a sense a kind of cartooning almost. So it's the fact that cartoonness is actually able to be brought into live action settings now it's kind of, it's comics infesting live action in a way. So it's fact you can actually do stuff like this more faithfully now, whereas back then you could not.
I do think that's interesting that the Meep's like the simplest design for a thing you've ever seen, but it and in the comics it's got a simple silhouette, very easy image, and you can doodle it on a napkin. But making it work in live action, making it emotive enough to land the jokes and land the threat, is actually a real challenge. Probably more so, I think, than the Wrarth Warriors. So interesting that such a simple design would be so difficult to pull off in live action.
I guess this is a kind of general 2023 60th anniversary thing, but I think it's also just nice that, like, obviously this story survived through the decades for its own reasons, but it's nice to, especially with like the Pat and Dave visiting set and everything, it's just nice to have these things not die, but not in a way where we're like zombifying them, like forever we're gonna, resurrect certain classic Who things and bow down to them because it's Doctor Who. It's kind of nice to like look at these discrete little eras of Doctor Who in different forms and from different creatives and just kind of appreciate it again and go, it was doing something pretty cool for a while, and these different strands, and it's just nice for that to not go away, I guess. I think there's a distinction between that and the zombifying, which we get with some strands, but I think this was a pretty unique way for Doctor Who to work for a while, how it was working with these run of comics, and so it's nice that it's stayed appreciated, I suppose.
Yeah, the discrete context, the discrete formats, they're all different in their own time periods, and there hasn't been an attempt to try and go back to the past so much as just allow there to be new iterations and formats of stuff. So it feels alive in the way that the zombified stuff doesn't. Yeah, I think you can accuse Doctor Who at various points of trying to do the whole zombification a bit too much, but I don't think this is an example of it. I think this is an example of I don't want to just say homaging the past or paying tribute to the past, because it's not just that. It's like it's more paying tribute to the capacity to evolve and the different aspects of various different time periods than it is trying to just wank off the past, if you see what I mean.
Do we have anything to close on that isn't that? Oliver, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, the audio adaptation ages Sharon up 4 years. I don't know if that's from a later comic or something. I don't know what's going on there. At the very end, she ages 4 years.
Wait, at the end?
And the story acts like that's at the end, yeah. It's to do with the black hole. Like, she's the same age throughout the whole audio, and then at the very end, she ages 4 years because of the radiation.
What the hell? What a random thing to throw into the story.
Right. The implication seems to be that that's a reason for her to go away with the Doctor, to give everybody else time to catch up, and she'll pop back when she's... But if you think about it, that doesn't actually work. That's the wrong way around. If she goes off travelling for 4 years with the Doctor while everyone... and then pops back to the same time and place, then she's now going to be 8 years older, not the other way around. So I don't know what that was about. I don't know what that was for. We've got no idea what's going on.
I think it's bizarre they thought they need to give her a reason, like an excuse to leave with the Doctor. Like, what? Why do you need an excuse? It's a TARDIS.
Right?
Like, come on. Why would you not want to go in there? That's a really, really strange instinct on their part.
Apparently it's from a comic called Doctor Who and the Time Witch from later in 1980, but I haven't read that, so I don't know the full context. That's just me wikiing it right now.
So they were mashing bits in from different comics, I guess.
Okay,
that makes a little bit more sense, but still, yeah, a bit strange.
But also, that really dilutes the point of her leaving with the Doctor, which is that it sounds great. It sounds like a great time. Not having to pay a mortgage. That sounds fab. So you're making it about a sci-fi problem instead of about a material concern that this character has, which is making it far less interesting. Strange choice. That was my last note.
Yeah, apparently there's a line in this Time Witch comic where I like the ending of the audio. 4 is like saying, well, look on the bright side. It's not, all bad that you've aged up. She should be glad that she's not going to be, a teenager for longer, because 4, quote, was a spotty teenager for 50 years, end quote. So, yeah.
I think that kind of flippant handling of things is kind of, that's very characteristic of, like, I guess the comic tone. Maybe it reads more weirdly when it's kind of I guess, drawn out and kind of it's sort of given like more and fleshed out and stuff.
That's an odd. I feel aged 4 years by that kind of addendum to the discussion we just went through. It's a great comic. Audio does some weird things. Hopefully the TV does some weird things in a good way rather than weird things in a weird way. We love the Star Beast. And that wraps up our discussion of the Star Beast, the 1980 Star Beast, the comic, the Star Beast. Let us know what you thought of what we had to say about the Star Beast, as well as what RTD, David Tennant, Pat Mills, Gary Russell, and of course Dave Gibbons had to say about the Star Beast in those interview quotes we picked over at. Thank you so much for listening, as always. Cheers.